Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. But let's be honest. How often in your imaginations have you allowed your mind to wander to visions of doom instead of harmony? To imagine chaos instead of peace? I spent much of 2020 with a recurring dream. In it, the world was ending, or at least the human part of the world was ending, thanks to the ego-driven leaders with their fingers on the nuclear codes. For months, I awoke from these dreams really deeply shaken, as if I had witnessed something approaching that I had no power to alter. Do you know what I mean? How many of you have ever peeked to see the ending of a book when you were only halfway through the book, right? Or read the synopsis of the season's episodes so you could get a sneak peek into what was about to unfold? I see some heads nodding. It seems like human nature to want to know how things are going to turn out, right? And even if we don't fully believe in destiny, we often treat tomorrow as if it was already decided. We just had to crack the code to find out. And I'm guilty as charged here too. For many years, I've played with astrology and pendulums and tarot cards, and always just hoping to get a little heads up into what was coming my way in my life. I remember once I was at a Renaissance fair, and I had a palm reader read my family's palms. Now, this palm reader looked at my oldest daughter and she said, you're going to be traveling to England to write. And then she told my youngest daughter that she was going to be next in a place in her life where she was going to need to know how to take care of herself. And then she told my then husband that he would be coming into some money. And then when it was my turn, she told me that she saw me in a house someday with large white pillars on the front porch. Literally, for months after that reading, I was in panic. Because you see, our local funeral home had large white pillars. And I had concluded that since my death would bring my husband life insurance money, and since my death would make it that my youngest would need to take care of herself more, and surely I had concluded that my oldest would just go off to England to become a writer, something that she had always wanted to do, that obviously this fortune teller had a premonition about my impending demise. It literally took years for me to let go of this implant of an idea. I kept walking around waiting for this moment to happen. Now, my youngest has done a pretty good job of adulting and taking care of herself, but my oldest says yet to go to England. My ex is still waiting for that bucket of money, and I don't live in a house with white pillars on the front porch. But to be fair, Emerson does have white pillars, so there's that. But still, I wonder, is there such a thing as destiny? Is it possible to read the signs of today to predict tomorrow accurately? And really looking at our present as a society right now, wouldn't any fortune teller surely conclude that humans are on a fast-moving train headed straight for a cliff? Sure, name your cliff. There's the climate change cliff, the political chaos cliff, environmental degradation, violence, oppression, hate. I mean, the list goes on. Does anyone else ever feel this way? That we're on a train that no one can figure out how to stop? I've never been a reader of post-apocalyptic fiction or novels set in a dystopian world. I've always fashioned myself too much of an optimist at heart for that. But lately, I admit there's some cracks in that self-image starting to emerge. And I don't think that's all that bad. I give credit to that Hulu series, Handmaid's Tale. Has anybody watched that one? Yeah, I give it credit for first rattling my eternal optimism. Maybe it was because its release coincided with some dangerous political shifts in our country, or that it vividly displayed the results of what happens when a rich patriarchy controls women's bodies. But it all just felt a little too close for fictional comfort. And then if we add in January 6th, 2021, the insurrection and the resulting reimagining of facts that has followed, I really can viscerally feel the rumbling of the tracks under our collective seats. And as I sit there on this train, I watch as the other passengers seem to have one of several different responses to the situation. First are those that say, hey, this really isn't so bad. It's going to all be okay. So they go ahead and order another drink and sit back and look out the window, amazed at how fast the trees are going by. And then there's the shouters. Now, these are the ones walking up and down the aisles yelling, Cliff, Cliff, Cliff. They're yelling Cliff, 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 but they're secretly hoping that their cries will awaken Superman or Wonder Woman, who must surely be amongst the passengers, and that the superhero will awaken and swoop in and save the day. Of course, there's the other ones. There's the ones that accept that we are all just doomed, right? Some of them are gathered around a table designing phallic-shaped spaceships, rocket ships to take them and their friends off this train. Now, I have never been in the third group. I have to admit, I've been known to vacillate between those first two groups at times. Everything's going to be okay. It's all right. No, it won't. Somebody help us. It's okay. It's okay. It's going to be okay. Help. Superhero. Right? But I do believe there's a fourth response to our current train trajectory, and it just so happens to be the title of today's message, Your Prophetic Voice. The prophet is one who recognizes the present, but is not bound to it. They are inspired to voice a vision of the world that has not yet come into being. And most importantly, the prophet is one who dedicates their life to act on behalf of the vision they see. Now, traditionally, prophets were few and far between. They were said to be the chosen ones, tasked with delivering God's message and declaring doom if God's directives were not followed. But I think that was in the past. I think today's prophetic voices are not so scarce at all. In fact, I'm banking on it. I believe that today's prophets are more of a self-chosen bunch than really a divinely ordained bunch. In a magazine called Essence, in a 2000 article, the science fiction writer and novelist Octavia Butler, she recounts the story of an encounter she had with a young reader. I liked this experience she had. She said, well, just so you know, among Butler's novels, there were two of them that take place. It's a kind of a near future. I mean, kind of where we are now, but written a while ago. And it's a future of increasing drug addiction and illiteracy. And there's a big popularity of prisons and an unpopularity of public schools, the vast gap between rich and everybody else. And it also depicts the whole mess of problems brought on by global warming. So in this article, Butler describes this young reader coming up to her and saying, so do you really believe that in the future, we're going to have all the kind of trouble you write about in your books? And Butler replies, well, I didn't make up the problems. All I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now, and I gave them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. It's a prophetic answer, right? But the young man challenged her and said, okay, so what is the answer? And Butler replied simply, there isn't one. The young boy looked at her in horror and said, what do you mean no answer? Do you mean that we are all doomed? And Butler smiled and said, no. And she clarified. She said, I mean, there's no one single answer that will solve all of the future problems. There's no magic bullet. But instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. And you can be one of them if you choose to be. I know it sounds nice, and I often hear people express frustration that there are so many problems and the problems are so big that anything any one of us could do would be so small that it doesn't make a difference. And this feeling is understandable. And I know it's not new in human history either. The problem is always bigger than it feels we have the capacity to handle. And any issue today could surely grow into a major disaster tomorrow. But I think that is precisely why we need to free the prophetic voice from its isolation reserved for a chosen few. The truth is, I think every passenger on our collective train has a prophetic voice. Most of us just have not yet realized the imperative that we access it. Preparing for this message, I've been reflecting on and reading many of the prophetic voices of ancient times and modern times. From those ancient prophets to the modern day ones like Martin Luther King and Clara Barton, who we heard about, Mahatma Gandhi, Rachel Carson, Desmond Tutu, Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, John Lennon, Starhawk, Chief Seattle, and the list goes on. When I read about their lives, I came to the conclusion that they all did 4 key things, and I want to share those with you today in the hopes that it may awaken your own prophetic voice. Now, the first thing that these prophets, these prophetic voices did, is that they each in their own way seem to have learned how to slow down and connect with something greater than themselves, greater than the cacophony of sounds of modern life. Now, in ancient stories, the inspired ones all had their moment of pause, right? We read of Buddha, who sat under the Bodhi tree for 49 days before his enlightenment. We read that Jesus went out into the wilderness and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights before he began his ministry. In the story of Krishna, he stands at the battlefield in this deep state of contemplation. Muhammad had gone and entered a cave for a long period of time. For modern prophets, the pause happens in different ways. For some, it happens in daily prayer through their faith. For others, it happens in nature or through music. But somehow, to be a prophet, one must find a way to listen, not to the fortune tellers or the news or even other humans. The prophetic voice has to find a way to listen to something deeper. The prophetic environmentalist Rachel Carson once said, "There's something infinitely healing in the repeated refrain of nature." And so she went there often just to listen. And I think this first but vital step is so often overlooked in our modern day push for the answers, right? We sometimes convince ourselves that we don't have time for this going inward, that there's too much to do. But the prophetic voices tell us that there is so much to do, we can't not take this time to go inward. Because it is by going inward that we touch upon the second key that I saw in all of these prophetic voices. It is by going inward that the realization comes, that the vision comes, the inspiration comes. Nelson Mandela: "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom," he said, "I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." It took years in prison for Mandela to come to this place of realization. But without it, his transformative power may never have been harnessed in the same way that it was. And this really brings us to the third key that I noticed in all of these prophetic voices, and that was their ability to share the vision with the world. The prophet doesn't just envision a different world inside their own heads or journal about it in copious journals put on their shelves or in a drawer. A prophetic voice paints the picture for others to see. Right? John Lennon, imagine. On August 28th, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech to a massive group of civil rights marchers gathered around the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Partway through the speech, a good friend who had heard themes that he had said again and again as he was speaking to her, as she was listening to his speech, she called out to him from the sidelines and said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." So prophetic for herself. Because it was in that moment, and you can see this on the films of the speech, that Dr. King, he leaves the prepared notes behind and he improvises the entire next section of the speech. It's that historic section that starts. And so even though even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream, right? Sharing the vision, his dream, was so pivotal to the movement and to history, and I think to us still today. Prophetic voices must share their visions, and they must share their visions over and over. I was touched when I read a piece from Chief Seattle. It was one of his last official communications to the white man. He was responding to an offer they had made for their land. In the letter, he names much of the harm that had come to his people. And then he says this. He says, "Our religion is the tradition of our ancestors, the dreams of our old men, given them by the Great Spirit, and the visions of the shamans. And it is written in the hearts of our people." And he goes on, he says, "The dead never forget the beautiful world that gave them being. They still love its winding rivers, its great mountains, and its sequestered vales. And they ever yearn in tenderness over the lonely-hearted living and often return to visit and comfort them." So he's painting this picture of how his people are in relationship with the land and how it is traditional for them to have this connection to the ancestors, right? That the ancestors are still alive and still visit the land and still visit the living. And that's wrapped together. Though he could not stop the change that was upon him, it's like in that speaking the vision, he was laying claim to that territory for his people, right? And when we read those words today, we are reminded of how far apart from that style of living we are. We are reminded of the harm of those actions, not only to the indigenous people of the moment, but to all of us. So a prophet too, it's not just looking forward. I feel like the prophetic voice looks back, looks present, and looks forward. Now, there's one more key I noted about these modern prophetic voices, In each case, they dedicated their lives to turning their visions into actions, but never alone, always with others. Now, we may not be as eloquent as Martin Luther King Jr. or profound as Chief Seattle or any of the other prophets written about in the history books. But I think that's okay, because I think there are 1,001 answers and 1,001 opportunities we have to share our visions in many small ways throughout our days and in more profound, bigger ways. It's that planting of the seed, right? In 1968, when he was reflecting on the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King said this. He said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And I think that brings us back to the speeding train we're all sitting on, right? How often are we each guilty of staring out the window of that speeding train in silence? Or jotting down in our journals a world we'd like to see and then putting that away for no one to see. I know these tendencies in myself are some of the reasons that I became a Unitarian Universalist. In his book called Prophetic Encounters, Dan McCanon, who's a Unitarian Universalist, offers this. He says, when human beings encounter one another deeply in the midst of the struggles for freedom and equality and community, then prophetic power is unleashed. In other words, our prophetic power probably won't be unleashed all by itself. It's this combination of the going in and the coming out. One of the purposes of the Unitarian Universalist faith is to provide a space for individuals to come together, to be reminded again and again of their own prophetic voice. We need to remember to take a pause, to recognize our visions, and then through each other's company, to become emboldened to bring that vision to the world in voice and in action. You know, the train we are on may be heading toward a cliff. And the palm readers may see the destruction that lies ahead. But I don't think we need to fear, because I think our train is filled with prophets whose prophetic voice have the power to write the next chapter of this story. One of Octavia Butler's early notebooks was found after her death. And on the inside cover was written a vision for her life and her career. It included many great successes as a writer, all of which would eventually come true. Now, at the time, she was a young writer, so these could have been seen as just fanciful affirmations. But she wrote this line at the end that I think was very powerful and prophetic. In dark letters at the bottom of this page, a young butler wrote, "So be it. Now see to it." Octavia was no more or less a prophetess than any one of us has the potential to be about our own lives or our collective lives. But in her pronouncement, I think it showed two things. First, she knew what her vision was. And second, she knew she had responsibility in the creation of it. And so I'm going to end with two very simple questions, my friends. Dear prophets, riding on this train with me, what is your vision? What is your vision? And please tell me, how will you see to it? I think together we can. I'm counting on it.